Last time we spoke about the Aitape-Wiwak campaign. General Dunkel's task force successfully invaded Mindoro, establishing airfields to support operations on Luzon. With General Eichelberger's 8th Army and General Kruger's 6th Army poised to capture the Lian Gulf, guerrilla forces on Luzon provided crucial intelligence. As plans for the Luzon invasion solidified, General Yamashita prepared defenses, predicting an assault between January the 10th and 20th. Despite dwindling resources, he aimed to delay the enemy's advance. Meanwhile, Allied forces readied for a swift amphibious attack to secure Manila and restore the Philippines government. In December, Australian forces established outposts at Ysail and Yambes, successfully repelling Japanese attacks. After fierce clashes, they advanced 40 miles along the coast. Meanwhile, the U.S. military bolstered defenses in Saipan and launched bombing raids on Japanese facilities, achieving mixed results. Despite heavy losses, they began to impact Japanese production capabilities. As the month ended, the Japanese launched a final assault on the Marianas, but the Allies continued their strategic advances, setting the stage for future operations. This episode is The Invasion of Luzon. Welcome back to the Pacific War podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my newly titled podcast, Echoes of War, over on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released 2 Christmas-themed episodes, the first covering Sir Winston Churchill getting drunk with President FDR at the White House, and the second about Christmas on Guadalcanal in 1942. Likewise, on Echoes of War, you can find corresponding podcasts on the same subjects. If you'd like to further support me, you can check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either, you get access to the exclusive podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. We last left off with plans for Operation Mike 1 being finished. General Swift's 1st Corps was ready to land on the eastern beaches of the Lian Gulf, while General Griswold's 14th Corps prepared to go ashore on the western beaches. Additionally, successful diversionary operations had been conducted on Mindoro, and Admiral McCain's Task Force 38 executed several moderately successful strikes against Formosa and the Ryukyu Islands in early January. Meanwhile, the 14th Corps elements staging at New Britain completed loading on December the 10th. Those mounting at Bougainville finished 2 days later. On the 17th, all groups of the 3rd Amphibious Force rendezvoused at the Lian Gulf, on eastern New Guinea, to rehearse the Lian Gulf assault. General Griswold felt that the 37th Division's rehearsal was satisfactory, but had much fault to find with the 40th Division, remarking upon, quote, "a general failure to observe the spirit of the rehearsal." As a result, further training was conducted on Manus Island, in the Admiralties, where the convoy reassembled on December the 22nd. On December the 27th, Admiral Wilkinson dispatched his LSTs and LSMs, followed by the remainder of Task Force 79 4 days later. On that same day, Admiral Barbie's convoy, which included Major General Leonard Wing's 43rd Division, loaded at Aitape before proceeding to Sansapor to load Major General Edwin Patrick's 6th Division. Task Force 78 departed Sansapor on December the 30th, heading to a rendezvous point with other elements of Admiral Kincaid's Luzon attack force. By January the 4th, all components of Task Force 77 had successfully gathered at Leyte Gulf, with MacArthur personally boarding the light cruiser Boys. Kincaid's minesweepers, Admiral Wendorf's bombardment and fire support group, and most of Admiral Durgan's escort carriers had already left the Gulf on January the 2nd to conduct preliminary operations off Luzon. By January the 6th, the rest of the Luzon attack force began moving towards Lian Gulf, led by Admiral Berkey's light cruisers. As Mindoro-based aircraft significantly increased the intensity of their assaults during the last week of December, sinking 7 transports and 2 escorts, and destroying over 140 aircraft. General Yamashita's tense and expectant forces were still racing against time to complete their battle preparations when the first warnings came that the enemy was again on the move. At 1:22 on January the 2nd, a naval lookout post on Surigao Strait reported that a long train of about 80 enemy ships, screened by destroyers, was moving through the strait into the Mindanao Sea. Other reports which followed immediately warned that large numbers of invasion craft were gathered in Leyte, Palau, and the Marianas areas, and that enemy submarines had appeared in force off the west coast of Luzon. At first, it was thought that the enemy convoy was merely a reinforcement and resupply group destined for Mindoro. On January the 3rd, however, developments began to point more conclusively towards a full-scale amphibious operation against Luzon. In the afternoon, just as the initially sighted enemy group passed into the Sulu Sea, a large enemy naval task force, including 12 escort carriers, 4 battleships, and 8 cruisers, was reported following in its wake through the Surigao Strait. Another delayed report stated that the enemy transport convoy of around 90 ships, under strong naval escort, had been spotted the previous day northwest of Palau, heading in the direction of Lian Gulf. General Yamashita grew concerned that a large-scale amphibious operation against Luzon was imminent. Consequently, he decided to relocate his headquarters to Baguio. These concerns were validated in early January when Japanese lookouts spotted Kinkaid's warships and transports approaching the island. In response, General Tominaga ordered aggressive kamikaze attacks on the Allied vessels, with a major assault set for January the 4th, causing severe damage to the escort carrier Amini Bay, which ultimately had to be scuttled. The following day, Japanese attacks persisted, damaging 2 escort carriers, 2 cruisers, and 3 destroyers, amongst other ships. In retaliation, Durgan's carrier aircraft launched strikes on Manila Bay, successfully sinking the destroyer Mami and damaging the Hinoki. On January the 6th, McCain's carriers joined the effort, with American pilots tasked with targeting air facilities at Manila and Clark Field. Despite adverse weather conditions limiting the effectiveness of the strike, they succeeded in sinking 1 transport and 6 oilers, as well as destroying 32 Japanese aircraft. Meanwhile, as Oldendorf's warships commenced their bombardment and minesweeping operations, kamikaze attacks continued. The destroyer minesweeper, USS Long, missed the attacks on Pearl Harbor by about just 2 days, but then immediately started anti-submarine patrols and escort missions. Its long trajectory in the Pacific War saw it make escort runs to Midway, Palmyra, and Guangzhou, participate in the invasions of Amchitka, Attu, and Kiska in the Alaskan waters, escort reinforcements to Roy and Namur in the Marshalls, participate in the invasions of the Admiralties, Hollandia, Saipan, and Palau, and be one of the first vessels to enter into Lian Gulf back in October. During the invasion of the Lian Gulf, Long began minesweeps on January the 6th, evading and firing upon Japanese aircraft as she carried out her intricate mission. Shortly after noon, beginning her second run, Long spotted 2 Zeros heading for her. Long went 25 knots in open fire, but a kamikaze crashed into her port side below the bridge, about 1 foot above the waterline. With fires and explosions amidship, Long lost power and internal communications and was unable to fight the fires forward. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Stanley Kaplan, fearing an explosion in the forward magazine, gave permission for the men trapped on the forecastle to leave the ship. But through a misunderstanding, the crew abandoned ship. Later that afternoon, a second plane attacked Long and exploded at the exact same spot, destroying the bridge and breaking the ship's back. Long finally capsized and sank the following morning. Alongside the Long, battleships California and New Mexico, along with the cruisers Columbia, Australia, and Louisville, 5 destroyers, another minesweeper, and 1 transport were all damaged. Admiral Wendorf was worried with good reason. Previously, kamikaze operations against his ships and those of other naval commands, though dangerous, had generally been executed by relatively untrained pilots who had taken few precautions to avoid detection and anti-aircraft fire, and who often appeared to be flying partially damaged, lightly armored planes carrying little ordnance. However, in January, the kamikazes had been operating in a far different manner. There was now a definite program of kamikaze operations, for the vast majority of the, perhaps 100 Japanese aircraft that had attacked the forces under Admiral Oldendorf's command since January the 2nd had at least attempted kamikaze crashes. In addition, the pilots seemed to be more skilled. They took every advantage of radar blanketing terrain, especially in the Lian Gulf area, and they flew towards target ships at extremely low altitudes, thus helping to avoid both radar and visual detection. Flight tactics included radical maneuvering designed not only to avoid anti-aircraft fire and Allied planes, but also to confuse observers as to which ship was the actual target. Finally, many of the kamikaze planes were heavily armored and armed. The Allies had expected great results from the relatively new proximity fuse for the shipboard 5-inch anti-aircraft weapons, but the Japanese planes usually appeared so suddenly and took such violent evasive action that the 5-inch batteries could seldom track them properly. The employment of the expensive special ammunition was therefore generally useless, and was sometimes even dangerous to friendly ships. Having missed approaching kamikazes by such distances that fuses were not even activated, shells sometimes sailed on to explode or near Allied warships, thereby causing some damage and many casualties. Gravely concerned about the effectiveness of the kamikaze attacks and recognizing that achieving air superiority did not prevent the enemy's suicide plans, Wendorf opted for a psychological strategy. He ordered the minesweeper and bombardment groups to persist with their operations even while sustaining damage, to convince the Japanese that their suicide missions were failing. Admiral Kamikaze shared these concerns and requested the cessation of all diversionary air operations to concentrate the main air offensive on Luzon. As a result, Admiral Halsey's carrier-based aircraft and General Kenny's ground forces were tasked with neutralizing all Japanese airfields in Luzon, supported by Durgan's escort carriers. On January the 7th, McCain's strikes in Luzon and Wendorf's bombardment of the Lian beaches continued, while underwater demolition teams entered the Gulf to undertake the dangerous mission of dismantling beach obstacles. Again, contrary to expectations, no beach obstacles were found. The frogmen encountered only a little rifle and machine gun fire, and the few beach defenses they observed appeared to be unoccupied. Their tasks and those of the hydrographic ships were completed on the 8th. In retaliation, 20 to 25 kamikaze targeted various segments of the Luzon attack force, managing to sink 2 minesweepers, and they damaged 1 LST. That night, Kincaid's destroyers successfully sank the Hinoke off Manila Bay. However, on January the 8th, the 3rd Fleet's units began advancing towards Formosa, as MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz suspected that the kamikaze were launching from there. Without Halsey's additional air support, the Japanese suicide planes once again attacked the Luzon attack force, this time damaging the cruiser Australia and the escort carriers Kitgum Bay and Kardashan Bay, as well as inflicting damage on 1 LSI, an LST, and an APA. Due to significant losses, by the end of the day, the 2nd Air Fleet and the 1st Combined Base Air Force headquarters was disbanded. The 1st Air Fleet received orders to withdraw to Formosa for reorganization, while the severely weakened units of the 4th Air Army were set to continue limited attack operations for a short time until a final evacuation could be carried out. Returning to the morning of the 8th to resume bombardment at about 8 o'clock, one section again hit the Lian area. About 10 minutes later, a destroyer standing close inshore and a spotting plane from a battleship reported that Filipinos were forming a parade, complete with the United States and Philippine flags, in the town of Lian. The fire was shifted to more westernly targets with leaflets, which were quickly prepared, instructing the Filipinos to clear the area. A spotting plane dropped the leaflets and the paraders dispersed. Bombardment started again as soon as the area seemed vacant. The reasons for resuming the bombardment of Lian and its environs in the face of friendly demonstrations ashore are unknown, especially since neither underwater demolition teams nor spotting planes had discovered any signs of Japanese activity in the area. The town, at least, seemed safely in the hands of the Filipinos. The most obvious explanation is that erroneous intelligence, having indicated that strong defenses would be encountered in the area, made it incumbent upon Admiral Wendorf to continue the bombardment, whether he wanted to or not. Too much was at stake to take a chance. The Filipinos in the Lian area could hardly have been pleased as they saw their homes and public buildings damaged or destroyed by what to them must have been a seemingly unnecessary bombardment. It seems a tribute both to the Filipinos and to the pre-war administration of the United States in the islands, as well as a severe and obvious indictment of Japanese occupational policies, that the people of the Philippines took such adversities in their stride, not permitting personal resentments to overcome judgment and loyalty. Throughout the rest of January the 8th, bombardment of the landing beach areas continued without incident. Practically no military installations or targets were found in Lian town and the airstrip area, and relatively few were discovered in the San Fabian region. The San Fabian bombardment vessels ran out of targets by about 3:30, and they moved back up the Gulf to strike the San Fernando area for another 45 minutes, completing the task that the Japanese kamikazes had interrupted on the 6th. The Lian area ships had long since ceased their firing for the day, thus ended preliminary bombardment operations. The heavy bombardment of the San Fernando sector on the 6th aroused great anxiety in General Yamashita's headquarters. An enemy landing in that sector would fall north of the main positions of the 58th Independent Mixed Brigade and create serious danger of a thrust towards Baguio over the Bong-Niculian Highway. The only means of meeting this potential threat was to change the planned employment of the 19th Division. The division was still in the San Fernando-Niculian area due to the postponement of the scheduled movement inland, and intense enemy air activity over the whole of Lian area made it improbable that it could move in any case. Consequently, on the 7th, the Area Army ordered the division to assume responsibility for the defense of the sector north of the line running through Santiago, Mangungane, Mount Bilbil, and Isin. Now its main strength was to be concentrated between Naglian and Baguio. With preliminary operations finished, Kincaid's amphibious attack convoys arrived at the entrance to Lian Gulf at around 4 a.m. on January the 9th. As the amphibious ships began landing operations, the fire support vessels of Admiral Barbie and Wilkinson positioned themselves for a final pre-assault bombardment. In support of these efforts, McCain struck Formosa, destroying 47 Japanese aircraft, sinking 7 ships, and damaging 11 others. Throughout the week, the fast carriers conducted a total of 3,030 offensive sorties, dropping approximately 700 tons of bombs at the cost of 86 aircraft. Pleased with the results of the anti-Kamikaze operation, Nimitz finally permitted Halsey to launch a major raid into the South China Sea, codenamed Operation Gratitude. Meanwhile, back in Luzon, the pre-assault bombardment commenced at 7 a.m., gradually shifting fire from the landing beaches to flanks of the assault area. At 9 a.m., the first amphibious vehicles began their approach from the departure line, about 4,500 yards offshore, while rocket-armed landing craft and aircraft bombarded the beaches. The landing beaches of the 14th Corps were located across the middle of Lian Gulf's southern shores and centered on Lian's airstrip and the nearby grounds of the capital of Pagasinan Province. In peacetime, one would have considered the shoreline a beautiful swimming beach, a magnificent strand of firm sand stretching eastwards almost 9 miles from the mouth of the Kalmay River to the mouth of the Dagupan. The east bank of Dagupan, which enters the Gulf midway between Lian and San Fabian, delineated the boundary between the 14th and 1st Corps. The bridges over the Dagupan were expected to provide the first easy means of contact between the two corps. Since there was a gap of over 6 miles between the 1st Corps' westernmost beaches and the 14th Corps' easternmost, it was imperative that the Dagupan crossings be seized without delay. Planners anticipated that insomuch as the 1st Corps troops would be a mile or so closer to the river at the moment of landing, they would be the first to reach the bridges. But it was the 14th Corps' responsibility to relieve the 1st Corps at the crossings as soon as possible. The 37th Division was to drive towards the Dagupan, while the 40th Division would make a quick thrust west and northwest to Port Saul and Almanos. Port Saul, located on the southwestern corner of Lian Gulf and at the western extremity of the Army Beachhead Line, possessed some importance as the site of the minor port facilities. Almanos, about 12 miles northwest of Port Saul, lay inland on the Bolinao Peninsula. Early capture of the road junctions at Almanos would help forestall Japanese attempts to organize counterattacks against the 6th Army's right flank. In contrast, the beaches assigned to the 1st Corps were widely spaced out. The units of the 6th Division were scheduled to land on the Blue Beaches, located midway between the Dagupan River mouth and that of the Bued River. The 103rd Regiment was to land on White Beach 3 at San Fabian, while the 169th Regiment would land on White Beach 2, nearly 2 miles to the northeast. Additionally, the 2nd Battalion of the 172nd Regiment was set to land on the nearby White Beach 3. Fortunately for the American forces, they encountered minimal resistance as the initial waves approached the shore, facing only some challenges from the ebb tide. Shortly after 9:30 a.m., the 1st and 20th Regiments landed on the Blue Beaches, with the 1st Regiment quickly securing the mouth of the Bued River and advancing 3 miles inland to Magladan, while the 20th Regiment moved towards Dagupan. Meanwhile, Wing's regiments landed on their designated beaches to the northeast but faced harassment from snipers, artillery, and motor fire from Lieutenant General Nishiyama Fukutaro's 23rd Division. However, the assault waves of the 14th Corps moved very slowly than expected, reaching the western beaches only at 9:40. The 185th Regiment captured Orange Beach, the 160th Regiment took Green Beach, the 148th Regiment secured Yellow Beach, and the 129th Regiment landed unopposed on Crimson Beach. After landing on the beaches, the 1st Battalion of the 185th Regiment marched to Agno River's mouth. Meanwhile, the 40th Reconnaissance Troop established a roadblock on the main road, just 3 miles east of Port Saul. The 2nd Battalion of the 185th Regiment advanced directly inland through Lian, successfully crossing the Kalmay River and an east-west segment of the Agno River. Similarly, the 160th Regiment crossed the Kalmay and assembled nearly 4 miles inland. The reserve 2nd Battalion of the 108th Regiment landed in Lian, while the 148th Regiment moved straight inland, crossing both the Kalmay and the Dagupan rivers towards San Carlos. The 129th Regiment entered Dagupan and then crossed the Patan River to reach Calasiao, while its 3rd Battalion eventually extended the line to connect with the 148th. By the end of the day, Griswold had established a beachhead stretching northwest from Calasiao from nearly 20 miles to the outpost near Port Saul. At the same time, Wings units encountered the most significant resistance from the three tiers of the ridges that overlooked the 43rd Division's beaches from the north, northeast, and east. The 43rd Division had the most hazardous and difficult S-Day tasks. On the division's left, low hills lay scarcely 3/4 of a mile inland from White Beaches 1 and 2. Stretching northward and coming still closer to Lian Gulf's eastern shore, a first line of low, grass-covered hills formed a somewhat broken ridgeline, the seaward slopes of which grew steeper as the hills proceeded north along the coast. Beyond this first range, which averaged less than 250 feet in height, lay another more irregular north-south ridge that rose to 350 feet. Still further east, a little over 3 miles inland, was yet a third steep-sided, grass-covered ridgeline, this one averaging around 600 feet. The three tiers of the ridges overlooked the 43rd Division's beaches from the north, northeast, and east. They provided the Japanese with natural defensive terrain, excellent observation, good positions from which to deliver direct fire on the beaches, and cover behind which there was protection from the essentially flat trajectory of naval support fires. Moreover, the ridges were close to the assembly areas further inland that could provide large Japanese forces with cover and concealment. In a single night, the Japanese could move considerable strength from these assembly points into the tiers of the hills to launch a counterattack against the 6th Army's left. While the 2nd Battalion of the 172nd Regiment advanced towards Hill 247, the 169th Regiment moved eastwards, successfully reaching Binday and extending its lines north along the gentle slopes leading to Hill 470. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion of the 172nd Regiment quickly secured the barrios of Mabilao and Alacan, ultimately capturing Hill 247 despite scattered resistance. As small arms and motor fire intensified, combat patrols advanced towards Hill 385, coinciding with the remainder of the 172nd coming ashore. Finally, the 103rd Regiment took control of San Fabian without facing any opposition, and then they advanced generally south and southeast towards Hill 200, halting just north of San Jacinto by the end of the day. While the assault units of the 1st Corps successfully landed by dusk on January the 9th, Swift's advance was not as deep as Griswold's, leaving several dangerous gaps between his units. Throughout the day, the Japanese launched sporadic kamikaze attacks on the Luzon attack force, causing significant damage to the battleship Mississippi, hitting the cruisers Columbia and Australia again, and damaging one destroyer escort. Meanwhile, friendly anti-aircraft fire resulted in numerous casualties aboard the battleship Colorado. In response to the enemy landings, Yamashita decided to deploy the 2nd Tank Division to the Agno River line near Tayug, where the armored units were to execute a counterattack from the northern flank if the enemy overextended. He also sent 5 battalions under Lieutenant General Suza Yoshitake to secure the Tibanatuan area, and he ordered Lieutenant General Okamoto Yasuyuki's 10th Division to position elements in the Triangle Hill and Tayug sectors to counter a potential enemy advance from Ligan towards San Jose, stationed the majority of the 11th Independent Regiment at Bongabong, and directed the Noguchi Detachment to move from Bicol to the Manila area. During the night, the 12th Surface Raiding Regiment, based at Port Sual, attempted to disrupt further enemy landings with a full-scale suicide boat attack on ships near the beachhead. Taking advantage of the element of surprise, the small explosive-laden boats approached undetected but only succeeded in sinking 1 LSI and damaging 8 other vessels. In other areas, increased guerrilla activities and allied airstrikes in northern Luzon had nearly stopped the Japanese from collecting and transporting vital food supplies to the critical defensive zones within the Baguio, Makayan, Bambang Triangle area. This disruption would hinder the 14th Area Army's capacity to conduct a prolonged defensive campaign. Although plans for a desperate full-scale counteroffensive were developed, Yamashita decisively rejected this strategy, instead ordering the 2nd Tank Division to cancel its intended counterattack and then regroup at La Piao, approximately 8 miles northwest of San Jose. Meanwhile, on January the 10th, Griswold's forces continued their advance inland. The 185th Regiment moved west towards Port Sual. The 160th Regiment progressed southwards about 8 miles. The 148th Regiment quickly advanced to San Carlos, and the 129th Regiment pushed forward to Malasique, where the 14th Corps faced enemy resistance for the first time since their landing. Additionally, the reserve 108th and 145th Regiment successfully landed on the Ligan beaches. To the north, the 6th Division shifted generally south and southeast, covering about 4 miles across the flat, dry open farmland, and by nightfall, they secured a front approximately 7 miles from the west to east. As they continued northeast, the 103rd Regiment expanded its front, with the 2nd Battalion advancing towards Maniaog, while the other 2 battalions moved to an area northwest of Hill 200. Lastly, the 169th and 172nd Regiments encountered the most intense resistance thus far, providing an early glimpse of the challenges that would be impeding the 43rd Division for the upcoming month. The 1st Battalion 169th Regiment, supported by close artillery and motor fire, engaged in combat along the steep grassy slopes of Hill 470, ultimately captured the summit by nightfall. Meanwhile, the rest of the regiment advanced across the Boët River towards Hills 355 and 318, but halted near the river due to heavy artillery, motor machine gun fire. To the north, the 172nd Regiment cleared Hill 385 and then moved towards Hill 351 and 580, gradually advancing along the southern section to the 3rd Ridge Line, which was located inland from the beaches. Additionally, its 1st Battalion progressed 2 miles along the gravel coastal road and conducted patrols along the ridge's crest. By nightfall, Kruger had determined that the 6th Army Reserve should be deployed in the 1st Corps area, as outlined in the pre-assault plans due to significant resistance faced by the 43rd Division. He suspected that the apparent lack of enemy resistance to the west was a trap, designed to lure the 6th Army into overextending its lines, making its flanks susceptible to a counterattack from the east. Fortunately for the Americans, Tominaga's kamikaze attacks began to diminish in the following days of the landing, with an attack on January the 10th resulting in damage only to the destroyer escort Lee Ray Wilson and 1 transport. The next day, the 43rd Division continued to face challenges in Luzon. The Japanese motor artillery fire along the 172nd's eastern front was so severe that Wing decided to shift the regiment's attack direction from east to north, resulting in minimal progress as they redeployed to strike Hills 351 and 580 from Hill 470. Additionally, the reserve 158th Regiment was landed to relieve the 1st Battalion 172nd Regiment on the coastal road. Looking southeast, the 169th Regiment nearly encircled Hill 318. However, despite receiving maximum support from Durgan's carrier aircraft, naval gunfire, and divisional artillery, they were unable to dislodge the Japanese forces, who had entrenched themselves in the hillside. Meanwhile, Griswold's advance inland to secure the Army beachhead line continued to progress well into January the 11th. On the 11th, the 185th Infantry patrolled and consolidated its positions on the western flank, suffering no casualties, killing 5 Japanese and capturing another. Early in the morning, a Chevrolet sedan of about 1940 or 1941 vintage, occupied by 2 Japanese, came calmly down the coastal road from the direction of Port Sewell. Obviously unaware that Company C of the 185th Infantry maintained a roadblock on the highway, the Japanese practically ran into the American outpost before they realized their situation. Before they could recover from their surprise and consternation, both Japanese were dead, and Company C had acquired some luxurious transportation. Meanwhile, the 160th Regiment reached Aguilar, a road junction already held by Filipino guerrillas. The 108th Regiment closely followed the 160th, and the 148th Regiment established a line from Dumpe westwards for 4 miles to Bacnar, with patrols extending further south to Urbistando and Bayambang. By the end of the day, the 14th Corps had either occupied or outposted nearly all the territory within the Army beachhead line in its sector. However, with Swift's units unable to keep up with the advance southwards, Griswold faced the risk of exposing his eastern flank if he continued to push forward. Therefore, the 1st Corps needed reinforcements to prevent widening the gap along the Corps boundary. As a result, the reserve 63rd Regiment and the 13th Armored Group were deployed in the San Fabian area, while the 6th Ranger Battalion, which had landed on the Blue Beaches the previous day, moved over to the Dagupan area. Additionally, Major General Charles Mullen's 25th Division began to assemble between the Agio and Padalan rivers. Despite these developments, casualties had been significantly lower than expected, with 55 deaths and around 185 wounded, primarily from the 43rd Division. Japanese casualties in the ground operations were relatively low as well, with American estimates suggesting between 150 to 200 Japanese killed. While this was going on, Task Force 38 made its way into the South China Sea via the Luzon Strait on January the 10th, accompanied by the refueling group. Although poor weather conditions thwarted a scheduled refueling that day, Task Force 38 was completely fueled by noon on January the 11th and prepared to carry out Halsey's ambitious raid. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my newly titled podcast, Echoes of War, found on all major podcast platforms. For the holiday season, over on my YouTube channel, I released 2 Christmas specials, one featuring Churchill getting drunk with FDR at the White House, and the other one, Christmas on Guadalcanal in 1942. Both of those are also found in podcast form over at Echoes of War. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Joining either gets you access to the exclusive podcast with over 26 plus episodes and ongoing, early access to all of the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. As the Allied forces prepared for a major assault on Luzon, Kamikaze attacks intensified, leading to fierce battles and unexpected challenges, but Filipino resilience shone through despite all the devastation. On the shores of the Lian Gulf, American forces launched a strategic landing, facing minimal resistance, but soon encountered fierce Japanese counterattacks as they advanced further inland.